Welcome to podcast number 66 for Thanks for Your Service. Our focus is on historical topics relating to the Australian military. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter and YouTube. Just search for Thanks for Your Service. Our website is www.thanksforyourservice.net and you can email us at info@thanksforyourservice.net. If you've ever ventured into a local park in Australia, you may have come across a remnant of the colonial era of our military past, an old cannon or a gun. John Rogers has spent considerable time and effort in researching Victoria's guns. John, my interest in the guns came from Surrey Gardens in Melbourne, with boys climbing on these old cannon next to the shrine in the gardens. And many parks in Victoria have examples of colonial guns. Where do we start with the story of the guns in Victoria? Can we first define what is a gun?
A gun's just something that explodes to fire a projectile. It's a pretty basic definition, really. They tend to be. It's just interesting that you mentioned you saw boys climbing on them. Since 1888, there's been a group of people in Victoria that have sort of dedicated themselves, a bit like the Illuminati in those films from the Crusader times, where this body sort of dedicates itself to preserving the guns, and they're not known to each other basically. But since 1888, the Children's Gun Polishing Brigade has been religiously polishing these guns. And if you ever see guns that aren't accessible to kids, they're definitely they're not polished. They're rough. They're rusting away. And there was a gun in Ballarat from Cerberus from 1898 up till 1987, pristine condition. It goes down to HMAS Cerberus, where the Children's Gun Polishing Brigade can't get to it, and it's sad to see it degrading. Even underneath, they seem to get their legs under there. And there's two others in Victoria Park in Ballarat, inaccessible. Well, kids don't go there, and they're terrible. But the rest were in parks, as you know, the ones in Surrey Gardens, nicely polished. Sorry, you said, okay, what happened? There's two types of guns, or two categories of guns, really. There's the guns that came out as armament on ships, like the Cerberus or the Nelson, and lots of other, the Victorian Albert and the First Victoria. So there's guns from ships, but then there's the shore defence guns. And the shore defence guns can be the same guns, actually. There's a gun we had at Seaworks, now going back to Clunes. We don't know if it's a shore defence gun or off HMCS Victoria. Unless you got the number, you can't tell. Whereas other ones are clearly shore defence guns and some are clearly ship's guns. Probably worth knowing is the guns you see around, the ones in Surrey Gardens, they're what you call muzzle loaders, where everything gets shoved in the barrel and rammed down, and then there's a fuse that gets fired, fires a gun. Fuse gets lit, that fires a gun. But the earlier and the later guns are breech loaders, where things get poked in the back of the barrel, it's sealed up, and then it's fired. And you'll find some early ones of those and some later ones of those around. But the guns you're referring to are from colonial times, the 1800s.
And how do we start with this story? How did they get here? Why are they in the many parks?
Okay, well, Victoria was aware that we might be attacked by a foreign power. At one stage, we worried about the Americans when there was a dispute with the northern United States during the Civil War. The Russians were a perennial concern, threat, and even the French at one point. So Victoria, Sydney was protected by the Royal Navy that was stationed up there on the Australia station. Victoria really was too far away. So we got shore defence guns, and then we started a Navy, and we had a Navy with, at the most, it could put out 16 vessels if it came to the crunch. Half of those were full-time, torpedo boats, gunboats, the Cerberus, which was a monitor, ironclad, and others were temporary ships that overnight could be fitted with guns. At the end of the colonial times, you've got a lot of obsolete guns laying around. The Nelson's gone up to Sydney as a hulk, basically, and all its guns are taken off, so that's 42 guns that are sitting around. Other guns were 68-pounders, the big ones. If you've seen the Eureka Stockade Monument in Ballarat, and there's some down in the western ports of Portland and Port Fairy and Warrnambool, they're obsolete by then. In fact, most of them were. And if you could put in, the government let it be known that if you wanted these, you could have them, local councils. So local councils, you tended to be need to be on a railway line to get them there, affordably. So a lot of councils put in for them. Like there's one in Colac, there's one in Tarnagalla, there's one in Clunes, and 2 in the Surrey Gardens now. I don't know how you qualified for 2. Ballarat's got 4, 8, 12, I think, or 16 guns up there. All different types.
We've mentioned Ballarat, and you mentioned some other towns in Victoria, but are there other parts of Victoria where these guns are located as well?
Oh, they're right around Victoria. Hamilton, I mentioned Colac, Echuca. Warrnambool and Portland and Port Fairy had guns because they were, in 1870, when the railway got down to those western ports, directly to Warrnambool and Port Fairy and via Hamilton, Ararat and Hamilton for Portland, suddenly the bad guys could land not just at Western Port Bay or Melbourne, they could land at Port Fairy and get a train ride to the city, take over the train. So we had to defend those 3 western ports. So there's fortifications down there with 80-pounders, 68-pounders, 32-pounders, quite a big collection down there.
And you mentioned the Nelson, and I gather in colonial Victoria, am I right to say that the ship was known as Her Majesty's, was it a Victorian ship, HMVS, or what was the prefix for the name?
It was built after the Battle of Trafalgar. I think it was ordered a month after the Battle of Trafalgar. And when it was commissioned, 4th of July, 1814, it was commissioned as HMS Nelson. It was the biggest warship the British had built to that time. Interesting, 200 years later, on the same day, the British commissioned or christened HMS Queen Elizabeth. The now biggest British warship ever built. I don't think it's a coincidence it was the same name. It was obviously around the same time, so they made it the same day. Nelson was built or was launched in 14. As you know, the Napoleonic Wars finished the next year. So Nelson was completed. They never actually put masts on it until about 1846. It never had guns on it until it was sent out here. So it sat around laid up in ordinary as HMS Nelson. It's fascinating, though, is that because of the Battle of Trafalgar, where the British sailed straight towards the Spanish and French fleet, the Spanish and fleet, it was sort of like the long part of the T. They were heading towards the ships laid up as a line. So the French and the Spanish could fire at the British, but the British couldn't fire ahead. They could not fire forward. So when Nelson was designed and built, it was built with a different bow, first time in 200 years, and they could put guns at the front, at the bow, and they could fire forward. Never needed because the Napoleonic Wars are over and there's 100 years of peace. But those guns are up at Northcote. No, they're not. They're up at Eagle Hawk near Bendigo. So when it came out here, it was actually lent to us. Before they sent it out, they put a steam engine on in 1860. They made it a bit longer so they could fit the steam engine in, I guess, and they cut it down. So 2 gun decks. It was 120 guns when built. So they cut it down, probably 90, but it came out as 48 from memory. And it came out here on loan as HMVS, Her Majesty's Victorian ship, Nelson. It actually had some bits on it from HMS Bellerophon, but probably not worth going into that because we're talking about guns today. And it came out and was used as a boys' training ship. There were a lot of kids on the street, gold rushes. Kids tended to get separated from parents or abandoned. And so the government set up these industrial schools And one of them they decided would be on Nelson. First it was on Sir Harry Smith. Then when Nelson got here, all the boys went across to Nelson. And it wasn't a reformatory. They did have reformatory ships, but this wasn't. This was just to give kids something to do and to look after them. They slept on board the ship, and quite a few of them joined the Victorian Navy as a result. But Nelson was a training ship for a while. Then it was made the flagship of the Victorian Navy, and it was obsolete. And we had this cutting-edge breastwork monitor, Cerberus. But if you were the captain and the officers, you didn't want to be sleeping in Cerberus or stationed there during the day, because if the steam wasn't up, there's no ventilation, there's very limited light. So they made the flagship Nelson because it had windows and ventilation. And there's a great photo of the paymaster standing up in the captain's cabin. He couldn't stand up inside Cerberus. He was 6'1".
Goodness.
So it was used to service the torpedo boats when they went down for exercises. But it had guns, but, it was wood, It was not that slow, but it was obsolete as a warship. But it had its roles.
So in Surrey Gardens, the guns are known as Brooke's babies. I think Brooke was a counsellor who arranged for the movement of the guns into the gardens, and I believe that they came from the Nelson. But what other guns in Victoria came from other ships?
Okay, well, first with the Nelson, the guns at Surrey Gardens weren't fired much. They were pretty obsolete. They were 32-pounders smooth bore. The British took a bunch of similar guns. The ones in Surrey Gardens are about 2 tons. The weight's actually on the barrel. If you look at the barrel, it'll say 42-something, and that's 100 weights, quarters and pounds. And it's about 20 hundredweights to a ton, so they're roughly 2 tons. I'd probably only fired about 10 times each, guesswork. The similar guns, but 3 tons, were bored out a little bit, had a wrought iron tube put in them, and they were rifled. So if you go to Tarnagulla, Colac, Hamilton, and other places, there's 4 in Ballarat, they're rifled. So there's grooves going down the barrel in a twisted fashion. And the idea is the shell gets pushed down there. There's studs on the side of the shell. It engages the grooves. And when you fire it, it spins clockwise. So it goes further and it's more accurate. Whereas the 32-pounders in Surrey Gardens and these guns, the 64s before they were converted, just fired a cannonball. And they're nowhere near as accurate. So the ones at 64-pounders, the bored-out, upgraded guns, Hamilton, Colac, Ballarat, and a few other places, I think Echuca's got one, they were fired about 50 times each while they were on Nelson, and there were 20 of those. The ones at Surrey Gardens probably only fired for signalling purposes, salutes and stuff. Also on Nelson, there's the big ones at the bow. They're called bow chasers. They were 68-pounders, so the same as the ones at Eureka Stockade and down at the Western Ports. There's some. The ones at Eaglehawk, the bow chasers, they were, as I said, 68-pounders. They were bored out and had a barrel poked into them, so it stuck out longer than the 68. And they could fire 7-inch shells, not cannonballs. They could fire cannonballs, but I don't think they would have. Whereas the 64-pounders could fire the old cannonballs or the new spherical shots. The bow chasers are interesting. There was one of those fired down off St Kilda in 1877. And because they always rotate, if you've got St Kilda on your left, you're parallel to the shore, the shell will hit the water and bounce off to the right. Don't know why, but this one bounced left. So it went through an organ shop, just missed a chopman. This is from the newspapers at the time. Yeah. Bounced off Kilda railway station and ended up at the pub across the road. So my guess is it hit the side of a wave or something, because it shouldn't have gone to the left, should have gone to the right. So no one was hurt. There are other guns where people were hurt. They're dangerous things. So the Nelson basically had 3 types. It had some little ones as well. but they're not in parks. So the 32-pounders, the 64s, and these 7-inch guns. It's interesting, when they converted these 7-inch guns, the Admiralty declared they were the only guns on any of their ships, or I'm not sure, that could actually pierce the sides of HMS Warrior because they had so much punch. They're quite powerful. The rest of the guns on Victoria, on Nelson, wouldn't have been a lot of use in a fight unless you're hitting unarmoured ships.
What about other colonial ships and guns? What other examples are there in Victoria that people can see today?
Okay, our first warship was Sir Harry Smith, which was a bark, a small ship. Wasn't used with sails. It was sort of moored halfway between Williamstown and Port Melbourne. It had some smaller 32-pounders on, actually weighed more than the Nelson ones, but they're shorter barrel. Where are they? We just found one the other day in a front yard in Williamstown. There's one down at Fort Queenscliff. There's some down the Western Ports. So they were on the Sir Harry Smith, and the second ship, generally thought to be the first ship, but it was a year after Sir Harry, was Her Majesty's colonial ship Victoria. It was always referred to as HMCS because there was a later Victoria. It had the guns like at Clunes, and there's 4 up in Ballarat, and again dotted around the place. They're the smaller 32-pounders. They weigh about a ton each. And one of the ones up, I say before they were dangerous, one of the ones in Ballarat, 3777, I think, outside the Ranger Barracks, it was down at the Domain Battery just firing a salute. I don't know, what might have been a holiday or someone was in town. And the guy organising, the officer in charge, was a bit worried about the chap firing it, and he put his expert on, and then they rammed the barrel down with a wet, I forget what you call it. It's like a ramrod, but it's wet and cloth. So they rammed that down to get any embers. Anyway, they did that. Then they put the powder in for the second shot, and they're ramming that, and it went off and blew the guy's arm off, shattered it. He was on fire, but you put people out pretty quickly, but never got his arm back. So they fired the gun at that point and sent it up to Ballarat. And they did a cast of the barrel to see, what had gone wrong. They couldn't work out what had gone wrong, so they just weren't prepared to use it again. Other ships, I'm losing the track at times. Okay, Victoria and Albert, HMVS Victoria and HMVS Albert, they came out in 84. They're massive guns. They're 8-inch breech loaders. They're out at Northcote, either side of the main road going into Northcote. They're very impressive guns. I think Victoria had a 10-inch gun, but it was too big for the ship, so they took it out and put an 8-inch one on. What else is there? Well, Cerberus. There's one of the Cerberus guns, as I said before, moved from Ballarat to HMAS Cerberus, yeah. So basically, before Nelson came out, all the ships, well, Sir Harry Smith was just Sir Harry Smith. It was never HMVS, HMCS, probably because it didn't sail anywhere. It just got anchored there because the guns couldn't cover the whole Hobson's Bay, so it was in the middle, extra protection. Nelson came out, and then all the ships from then on are Her Majesty's Victorian ship. So there's an HMCS Victoria and later on an HMVS Victoria.
In terms of the different designation, whether a ship was a HMCS or a HMVS, what determined that?
I don't know. I don't think there's anything. We call them HMCS, the first one, and to differentiate later, I guess, or because we were being more serious about having a navy. I don't know what the reason is there. In Queensland, they had some gunboats, very similar to, our Albert, same as Albert actually, Gayandar and Paluma, Thunder and Lightning in their local Aboriginal language. They were HMQS, Her Majesty's Queensland ship, and they had some torpedo boats, but boats aren't HMS or anything because they're boats, they're not ships. In Australia, they didn't go for HMSAS. I guess it was too long. So they used colonial, HMCS, and that was Protector. And the only other colonial, they were 2 torpedo boats up in Sydney, and they had an old like a ship like Nelson, Wolverine. And there was a torpedo boat down in Tasmania, but never got named.
Mm. Is there still an operational gun in Victoria from the colonial era?
I'd say they're probably all operational. There's a reenactors group that fires various guns occasionally. So they fired ones down at Portland, Port Fairy, in Williamstown. A couple of big 9-inch guns on the foreshore there from Fort Gellibrand. And those guns got moved down the heads when we're really worried about the Russians. But what they do is they don't put in a full charge and a shot. You know, we had them fire a gun down at Half Moon Bay, and one of the spectators complained nothing came out. Well, you don't want to kill anyone, basically.
Yeah.
Well, that half a kilogram of powder in where you probably had 20 kilograms or something. I'm guessing of that. I'm not sure what each gun would have.
Mm.
And it makes a bang and everyone goes, ooh-ah. But you wouldn't want to put a full charge in because you might blow the barrel apart. Some of them you can't fire. The one at Dalesford's got a cannonball down the barrel. You put a camera in and take a photo, you can see it very clearly. One of the 9-inch guns at Fort Gellibrand's got one of the projectiles protruding from the barrel. And it's probably rusted in now. I don't know how you'd get it out. And these are muzzle loaders. You can't get in from behind. You know, you got to somehow roll it out. I don't know how. So they're supposed to be fireable.
And did any of the guns fire a shot in anger?
Well, the best thing about having a strong navy is no one turns up. No one turned up, whether it's because of that or it's a century of peace. There was an incident, 1870s. I think it was 18. I'd have to check. Just I wrote it down somewhere. 1858. Oh yeah, where the General Noel was leaving Queenscliff, and they decided to take the pilot and the customs guys and put them ashore and then head off. And fortunately, Victoria was in the area, so it went after them and brought them back. Now, one report said they fired a shot across the bow, but I've only read that once, and that was someone looking back 50 years or 30 years. So things get embellished over time. So the best reports are at the time. There was no mention of it. It was an American ship, and the American ship captains had a meeting in port and described it as piracy, but nothing came of it. I don't know if the Americans were upset or whatever, but if it was piracy, they must have been outside the 3.5 mile limit. We had no jurisdiction outside that limit.
Mm.
Although Victoria went off to New Zealand as part of one of the Maori Wars, and I read somewhere about it firing a shot there, but could never find it again. And the chap who knows most about it is keen to get that evidence. They sent men ashore and they fought, but I don't think they fired their gun there. Not sure. So we never killed anyone with them, except some of our own people got hurt by them.
Where did your interest in the guns come from?
Oh, well, from trying to do something about saving the Cerberus, which was a very powerful ship, our most powerful ship, heavily armed and heavily armoured. I started studying the ship, Cerberus, and the men sort of move around between the ships. The men all had cap ribbons that said HMVS Cerberus, but they'd serve on the torpedo boats or Nelson or the gunboats. They weren't designated just Cerberus crew. And they got guns, like there's some guns moved from Nelson to when it was pensioned off, that moved across onto Cerberus, quick firing guns, 14-pounders. Interesting, they're the only two guns of its type on the planet. And they went off to China with the naval brigades in 1900. We built down at the railway workshops, we built gun carriages so they could be manoeuvred on land. And as soon as we got to Hong Kong, the Brits said, well, we can't get ammunition for that. They're the only guns of the type on the planet. They changed the later model. They were prototypes. So they gave us some guns they could provide ammo for. And I guess they stayed over there. They probably melted down a long time ago. It's a real shame. And one of their shells recently. That was a find.
Now, you had previously developed a mobile phone application to describe and to track a lot of these guns, and you've done a lot of work recently, and thank you very much, that people can now access some information via the web. Where can they go to find out some more information about the guns?
Okay, cerberus.com.au/Victoria's Guns. And that takes you to a webpage that has links to all the different slideshows on the different guns. The app, 18 months after Google Maps changed their maps, and now it didn't work anymore. Not on my phone. I can do a lot of things with it, but I don't know, maybe one day we'll get some money and we'll rejig it. But you know how much to spend, and then Google Maps changes their maps again.
And if people are at a local park and they come across what they think is a gun from the colonial era, are there markings or are there identifiers that they can help or maybe check against your webpage? How do people find out more information about these guns?
Okay, jump your hand in the barrel, see if there's grooves, and the grooves are 2 centimetres wide, probably 2 centimetres, and that's the rifling groove. So that'll tell you if it's a rifle gun. Otherwise, if there's no grooves, it's a smooth bore. If you can't put anything in the back of it where you light fire the thing from the breech end, then it's a smooth bore. Then it's a muzzle loader. So there's smooth bore muzzle loaders, rifle muzzle loaders. There's markings on it, the weights on the guns. So as I said before, it'll have some are 45-6-2, which is 100 weights, quarters and pounds, and 20 hundredweight is about a ton. So you can identify them that way. If they got 42 and they're from Nelson. If they start with 25, they might have been on Victoria or they're short defence. If they start with 45, their short defence might have been on Sir Harry Smith. But this is all in the slideshows. You can pick that up there. If they're trying to think of 68 pounders, I can't think what weight. They're about 3 tons. The 68 pound, I should have mentioned earlier, or 32 pound or 80 pound, that's the weight of the projectile. Whereas if someone says it's the 64 pounders are also 6.3 inch guns because they're 6.3 inches wide. Whereas the ones on Cerberus were 10 inch wide by a 400 pound projectile. So you can see a Cerberus shell at 400 is much bigger than a 64 pounder. And Cerberus could fire all 4 at once. So you had 600 pounds heading towards you, do a lot of damage. 9 inch guns are 9 inch wide. I think they were a 300 pound shell. One thing's interesting about the 9 inch guns, or a lot of things are interesting. There's a fence down in Brighton made out of projectiles, shells from the 9 inch guns, which weren't shipped, they're only short defence guns. There's only like 160 shells making up this fence. Again, that's in one of the slideshows.
That's the podcast for today. The website for the guns is www.cerberus.com.au/Victoria's Guns. We're keen to hear your feedback by leaving a review on your podcast app. Your reviews help new listeners find our podcast. And you can help support this podcast via Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. The links are on our website and Facebook page, and your support helps us with the production of this podcast. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your service.